Good evening, I'm Dennis Ward, and this is Face to Face. Our guest this week is Kimberly Murray, who is a member of the Kanesatake Mohawk Nation, a lawyer who was the province of Ontario's first ever Assistant Deputy Attorney General for Aboriginal Justice. She was also the Executive Director of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. In June 2022, Murray was appointed as Independent Special Interlocutor for missing children and unmarked graves and burial sites associated with Indian residential schools. Kimberly, thanks so much for taking some time to be with us.
Thank you for inviting me to come speak with you.
I know you got a very busy schedule right now. I've tried to find a few different ways to describe special interlocutor, and it's not easy. How would you describe your role as special interlocutor for missing children, unmarked graves, and burial sites associated with schools?
Yeah, I get that question a lot from elders and survivors, and essentially I tell them, you know, my role is to be a liaison between their communities, themselves, the survivor organizations and groups that are doing the sacred work in the federal government, because I was appointed by the federal government, and just to really listen about their concerns that they have and talk to them about the barriers that they're facing, so I can bring those concerns to Minister Lametti and Minister Miller and try and resolve some of the problems that we're seeing developing as the investigations are starting.
Liaison, that didn't pop up on the thesaurus for some reason for interlocutor. How did you come to taking on this role?
I like to think that maybe my name got put forward because of the work I did at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I was the executive director and was heavily involved in the Missing Children and Unmarked Burials volume of the final report. After Kamloops made the announcement of the 215 children, I started working with the survivors at the Mohawk Institute at Six Nations of the Grand River, and working on starting the search on those grounds. And so I think it was mostly my background, having knowledge of the situation, the records, the problems that communities are facing, because I was working on the ground with communities doing the work.
Like you say, working on the ground there, for those who know, you also were for a short time with the expert panel with the Thunder Bay Police Services Board. Obviously, this must have been something that you really felt like you wanted to do, needed to do, to step aside from some of those other roles.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I did have to step down from the panel to take on this position. I am to be independent, and so I had to step away from any of the other work that I had made commitments to. And I felt that we were early enough in the Thunder Bay panel and the expert panel that it wasn't going to harm them too much. And they replaced me with two great Indigenous women, so I think it all worked out.
Like you say, the official title is Independent Special Interlocutor. I guess despite being funded by the federal government, do you feel that there is that independence there?
I certainly assert it. So, you know, I am an OIC, and that comes with sort of requirements that I have to follow certain Treasury Board rules around the money that has been allotted to our office. And, you know, we push we push the barriers around those rules. You know, a good example is just, you know, at our gatherings, just trying to feed people. You know, the cost of feeding people is, we're way over the guidelines of the Treasury Board. And but Canada's been responsive to us and not pushing back, and just sort of letting me do what we feel is necessary to be supportive of the communities and survivors that are attending.
Are there other examples aside from lunch that you had to assert your independence?
Well, I think you've probably heard them all before when it comes to any kind of commissions or these independent bodies. You know, the rules around hiring, and you know, the machinery of government is very slow, and when you only have a 2-year mandate, you want things to move fast, and so, you know, it's just getting around those processes in a quicker way and getting people to move faster.
Yeah, when we had Chief Commissioner of the National Inquiry, Marion Buller, on here, she said it was months just to get up and running, to get emails, cell phones. Were things moving quicker this time around?
Yeah, things were moving much quicker than that for us. We haven't had those same challenges.
As we mentioned off the top, from 2010 to 2015, you were the Executive Director of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. How do you think that has prepared you for this role?
Well, it's almost as if this role is just a continuation of the work that I was doing with the 3 commissioners. And as you know, the volume on missing children and unmarked burials had a number of calls to action. And the commissioners were clear that the TRC only started to do this work and much more work had to be done. And so, here we are 7 years later and we're finally starting to pick up where the TRC left off. And it's just a continuation, I think, for me, of the work that I was doing under the guidance of Murray Sinclair and the other 2 commissioners.
We mentioned the timelines there, 2 years, a budget of roughly $10 million or so. Are those, is that enough time, enough money to do this?
I think everyone could use more time and more money. When I took this position on, I did say to Minister Lametti, I don't think it's enough money, but I'm going to do what I can do for the amount of money that has been allotted to this, because the survivors deserve us to get this work done. And so, I'm not going to be whining about money and time. That's not what I'm about. I'm going to do what we can get done in the 2 years that we can. And so part of the things that we're doing is like holding these gatherings where we can bring more people together at once. Because I only have 2 years, I can't go into every single community, especially when we think about it's not just the Indian residential schools under the settlement agreement, it's the Indian hospital grounds and it's other sites of sanatorium that are being searched. There's no way I could physically go to every single site. So we will get that report done, the interim report and the final report on time.
You're 6 months or so into that 2-year mandate. Are there things that so far that stick out for you? I think one of the things that is really coming to light is that there's so much more truths that have to be told. And as we find more records, as we hear from more survivors, we're really seeing this trading or transferring of the children from one institution to the other. And that these entities and organizations that operated the Indian residential schools and the federal hostels were also operating the hospitals and were in the other types of institutions, the sanatoria and the reformatories. And so those same things that happened to the children in the residential schools were happening to them when they got sent to these other institutions. I think that's part of the history and the truth that is really starting to come out now that the TRC didn't talk about. The title is, for your title is Interlocutor for Unmarked Graves and Missing Children's associated with Indian residential schools. So you are still working though with sanatoriums, still things like that too. That's within your mandate? Yes,
it's in the mandate document, sites associated with Indian residential schools, and that's how we get to these other institutions. I think everyone was aware about the Indian hospitals and that kids would get sick in the schools. And be transferred to the hospitals and perhaps die at the hospital. And then, as we know, there are burials on the grounds of, former Indian hospital grounds. So it includes those other sites, and communities, when I go into communities, they're now looking at those mental health institutions that the kids got sent to. They're looking at those youth detention centers. That's a nice way of what we call them now, but they were called different things in the past. Mm-hmm. And really thinking, what happened in those institutions? And we see kids in the records being transferred back and forth from the residential school to these other institutions.
Again, 6 months into your mandate, what have been the challenges?
So I did release a short progress report and identified a number of the common concerns that we're hearing from communities and survivors as they do this sacred work. no secret, access to records, ongoing challenge, delay in getting access to records or just not getting access at all, and also problems with trying to find where the records are. And then access to lands. As we know, the federal government expropriated lands to build these institutions on from First Nations people, but they didn't return the lands back to the community. So now we have different pieces of land that are privately owned, corporately owned, and those landowners aren't allowing First Nations communities on the lands to do the searches for the children. So that's a barrier, and our laws aren't helpful in that area. This conference, gathering that we're holding this week here in Winnipeg is on community wellness supports, hearing lots of concerns over the lack of funding for health centers and supporting communities with their mental well-being as we search for the missing children. And we're hearing over these 2 days about it's a different type of trauma. This, ambiguous loss, not knowing where someone is for all these years. It's a different type of trauma that needs to be addressed.
Do you want to talk about the gathering happening here and upcoming ones? We just have to step aside for a quick break, and then we'll continue the conversation here on Face to Face with Special Interlocutor on Unmarked Graves and Missing Children, Kimberly Murray. Stay with us. Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is Kimberly Murray, the Special Interlocutor on Unmarked Graves and Missing Children associated with residential schools. And before the break, we were talking about some of the challenges that nations are facing in the search for suspected unmarked graves and missing children. How do we overcome things like access to documents and access to lands?
Well, maybe I'll speak to access to lands first. There's an important case that actually just came out from the Quebec Superior Court last month, and I think it's really important for the rest of the country because it's an example where Indigenous people went to court to get an injunction to stop development on the lands where they believe there are burials, and it happened in Montreal, where McGill University and the province of Quebec were redeveloping the lands of an old hospital called the Royal Victoria Hospital and the Allen Memorial. And it's a hospital that was known to have Indigenous children taken to. It was a hospital where many Inuit were taken to. And it's a known hospital where experiments were done on patients in the hospital. And there's a survivor that said that she had seen people with shovels at nighttime digging in the back of the hospital. And all this got brought to the court. And the Mohawk mothers, unrepresented, no lawyer, went to court and argued the great law and didn't rely on colonial laws and said, we need to search these grounds and this development needs to stop. And they were successful. And it was really important because, I think the judge realized we're at a time in history where we can't dismiss these claims from Indigenous people, that there's potential burials on these grounds. We're past that now. It's proven that there are burials on these type of grounds. And so when Indigenous people come forward and say, we think there's burials here because this is the stories of the survivors, then we need to come together and do a proper search. That's what reconciliation is, coming together and talking to each other and putting a plan in place. We don't have the barriers right now is that we don't have the laws that allow communities to just go onto the land to do the search without going to court, without bringing these sort of challenges. And so that's part of my work, is to make recommendations for a new legal framework that includes access to lands and perhaps returning lands to First Nations communities.
Definitely want to get to that framework as well. Are you getting a sense, though, of how many of these types of searches are taking place right now?
Last Last I saw, there were over 88 organizations and communities and survivor groups that have received some funding from the federal government to commence this work. And we know that that's just going to continue to grow. As I speak with communities, they're all at different stages. Some are just starting, some are just in the process of putting the applications together, and others are well along their way. But we know there was 140 Indian residential schools recognized under the settlement agreement, all those that weren't recognized, and then add the Indian hospitals and these other institutions. It's quite high, the number of institutions we're speaking about.
Part of this role as well is education, public awareness. There's a whole segment of the media who have big columns who write that there have been nobody found in these graves yet, that despite the oral history, despite what the TRC had to say, that this isn't proven. What do you say, and how do you overcome that in the public?
Well, one, it's false reporting, because there are known burials and there are actual examples of children's bodies washing up because when the riverbank and the water came up, bodies came out of the ground. That happened at Dumbo. Those were Indian residential school children buried on those grounds. Just because we have GPR now and we're not disturbing those burials doesn't mean those burials aren't there. We know there are kids buried on Indian residential school grounds. There are photographs of funerals happening on Indian residential school grounds with children at the children carrying the coffins, with the children standing there as the other child is being buried. We have survivors that have talked about being the ones burying them. So that's just false reporting. And people need to do a better job and read the TRC report and know that there are plenty of examples of children being buried on these grounds.
Good way to put that. Going back to the legal framework, can you tell us a bit about what that will mean, what that does mean?
Yeah, so as we don't have a federal law right now, a national law that protects burial grounds of Indigenous people. We have provincial laws, and they all have strengths and weaknesses. And often the provincial laws only get triggered when a shovel goes into the ground and hits the bones of the ancestors. And so that law gets triggered too late. We don't have any laws to protect those grounds when we say there are burials there. So it's this push that you have to dig them up. You have to dig the ancestors up and prove that they're there before we can protect these burials. There are examples in other countries, south of the Medicine Line in the U.S., they have legislation, a federal legislation for protect Indian burial grounds. We're looking at that, trying to hear from people there and First Nations there, what works, what's not working. Is there something that we can recommend for here in Canada? And I'm also told to implement the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People in the new legal framework, or the recommendations for the framework. And there are many provisions in the declaration that talk about the importance of protecting Indigenous burial grounds. And so that'll all be part of the framework I'll be recommending. And also that piece on privacy and access to records. We hear over and over again about we need sovereignty over our knowledge, sovereignty over our information, sovereignty over these records, and how do we get there? And that's what, hopefully the final report will speak to ways that survivors and communities feel should be implemented in the framework.
Hoping to talk a bit about that final report coming up, but we just have to step aside for one more quick break, and then we'll continue the conversation here with Special Interlocutor Kimberly Murray. Stick around. Welcome back. Our guest this week on Face to Face is Kimberly Murray, the independent special interlocutor on unmarked graves and missing children. Kimberly, just want to, when we look back at some of the other 5 years you spent with the TRC for one, I guess disappointed in where those calls for action are at 5 years later?
Yes. I don't even have to pause on that. I often say and speak about, I remember that day when the announcement came about the grounds of the Kamloops Indian Residential School, and feeling that sadness and that grief and that loss and feeling for the communities. And then I quickly became angered. Just thinking about, here we are 7 years, well, back then it was 6 years later, and none of the calls to action, 71 through 76, had been implemented. None of them. And today, as we're having this gathering on wellness, I actually, before I went to the gathering, I thought, I'm going to look at what the health chapter says in the TRC report. The very first line in the health chapter talks about the kids that died in Indian residential schools, and talked about how Canada has failed Indigenous people with health. And when I read the report, and I actually quoted it this morning when I was speaking at the gathering, it says it's shameful. And it's continuing today as I listen to community members at the gathering talking about how they're not receiving funding for community wellness, to create those centers that are needed for well-being. Those were calls to action from the TRC and many other reports. So yes, I am disappointed.
You mentioned other reports, the MMIWG final report, those calls for justice, many reports over the years. Does that have you concerned about your final report?
Absolutely. I'm also thinking about what can be said in the final report about ensuring implementation. People likely know, like Canada just now passed the legislation for the Council for Reconciliation. The TRC commissioners made that call to action for Council for Reconciliation to ensure that the calls to action got implemented. And here we are, we're just getting the council now. And so they were to be that oversight to make sure governments were held accountable and churches were accountable to do the implementation. So, I am thinking about what's the right body to place that responsibility of keeping sort of the light or the glare on the government and the churches to make sure that they implement any recommendations that I may make, along with the calls to action that haven't been implemented.
And that committee still has to go to the Senate, even though it's passed today. We're super short on time, Kim, but what would you like to see happen, I guess, to feel like your role, this role was a success?
Well, I would like to see the burial grounds protected, just like all the community members that I speak to and survivors. I would like to find those answers to those 4 questions: who died, and how they died, and where they're buried, and the questions that the TRC had asked. If we could answer those, then we'll have done what we were meant to do.
Well, we wish you all the best, and thank you so much. I know you got a busy schedule, for taking some time for us this week.
Thank you.
Of course, you can catch up on any episodes you may have missed by visiting our website, aptnnews.ca. This episode and all of our past episodes are also available as podcasts. You can find those wherever you download your podcast. And that is all the time we have for this week. I'm Dennis Ward. We'll see you back here next week.